time is limited. We've got a great panel of speakers here and a lot of ground to cover. I'm Trey, Hanbury. I'm with Sprint Nextel Corporation. I'll be moderating the panel. And what I'm going to do is offer a brief introduction, then I'll introduce the panelists, and we're going to turn it over to Harold and Greg for a few opening comments, and then we're going to go through a few questions for the panelists. As many of you know, the House passed the Radio Spectrum Inventory Act back in April. It's a 394-18 vote. And it's requiring a mapping and accounting of the spectrum being used by both federal and non-federal entities. This bill, if it's ultimately passed and adopted into law, would require a survey of the nation's spectrum, and NTIA would be required to report to Congress on how it's being used. NTIA would also have to identify which, if any, underused bands of spectrum could be reallocated for commercial use. So this panel is really about what happens next. In other words, assuming that there is an inventory required, what is the right mix of public policies to encourage radio frequency spectrum to be put into its most productive use possible? What public policies can encourage federal users to collaborate with commercial operators? And are there more effective ways to promote using spectrum resources more selectively or more efficiently on the federal side of the equation? This panel brings together several experts in the field of spectrum management, each with a distinct perspective on the issues. And let me introduce them now. Starting at my immediate right is Kathleen, Vice President for Federal Regulatory Affairs at T-Mobile. Next to her, we have Sepulveda, Senior Advisor to Senator Kerry. Then Peter Tenhula, who is Vice President and General Counsel of Shared Spectrum Company. Mark MacCarthy is next. He's an Adjunct Professor, Communications, Culture, and Technology at Georgetown University. And on the far end is Edward Davidson, Deputy Associate Administrator for Domestic Spectrum Management and Chairman of the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee. And Ed wins the prize for the longest title, which is actually abbreviated from the full title. With that brief introduction, I think I'd like to turn it over to Harold and Greg for a few opening remarks.
Thank you, and I will again begin with thanking the panelists for being so patient with my just-in-time dynamic paper delivery system, which I hope promotes efficiency here. The other element that we talk about when we are looking at the issues of federal spectrum are transparency and enhancing the efficiency of federal operation. One of the things that has been discussed, was discussed a little bit in the last panel, is that federal agencies are trying to make do with their existing allocations. They are trying to stretch these things as parts of their budgets, and we do not have any kind of overall effort within the federal government to actually have a policy about how we're going to use wireless capacity to improve delivery of federal services, to promote innovation by federal agencies to use wireless capacity, and to increase efficiency overall. We are still essentially in a mode where we have coordination to avoid interference, and generally not having access to information either for the public to be able to be involved or for the agencies. And some of this, as I raise, is again just the very basic problem for agencies that if you are honest about what you're doing and try to be efficient, your reward is that you get stuff taken away from you. So what we have tried to do here is to propose a series of steps that will get past the current issues of trying to figure out what's going on and move to some place where we can all understand, all be on the same page, and where the federal government itself can actually start thinking about real federal wireless policy other than how do I clear off more spectrum. The first step that we've outlined is one that should be something of a gimme in this administration particularly, is NTIA, and to the extent that it works with FCC on some of these issues, the FCC should just jump in on a new government initiative to make their own website a lot clearer, a lot more accessible to the public. and to set up procedures, to make it clear what the procedures are to apply for private act use in federal bands, which there is in fact a process, and for the FCC to actually expedite those applications which they're required to do by law. The explanations that Larry and Carl gave earlier about how the federal government allocates spectrum, how this works, were extraordinarily clear, very straightforward to understand, and I wish that there was somewhere on the NTIA website where something that plain English and that specific was upfront and prominent for people who are looking to understand how the federal government allocates spectrum and how they use spectrum. The next stage is something much more dramatic. What we call for is zero-basing federal spectrum as a means of trying to get a handle on the who's doing what and how are we doing this more efficiently, not for the purpose of punishing agencies and taking stuff away from them, but because to realize all of the benefits that we would like to see in federal policy, we've got to go back to basics. We've got to ask each agency to look at the way it's using spectrum now and seriously ask itself, is this really the best system, or are we just doing it this way because that's how we've always done it and it's too much of a hassle for us to try to improve things? What are our real needs going forward? What would we like to be doing in order to improve operations? Really dig into these questions and compile a serious database that would be accessible to the public to the extent possible, although recognizing the national security issues, but which would allow the NTIA, now in coordination with the CTO, to really think about how the federal government can get the most bang for its buck, with the longer-term idea of doing the creative thinking that everybody today has been saying we need to do, of how do we move to other models, how do we move to public-private partnerships, how do we move to ways which take into account the growing need for wireless capacity, not just for cellular, not just even for all commercial users, but for federal users, for state and local governments, for commercial users who are not cellular providers, and for cellular providers. How do we create a sustainable spectrum policy? And that can only start with a real understanding by everybody of the language we're using, the real needs that we have, and the proposals that we've set forth here, we think work within the existing statutory framework and allow for that basic information to be developed.
I think one of the most important things to realize about our proposals is that they offer an opportunity to generalize efficiencies both economically and socially over our spectrum held both by the federal government and by other entities. What we are talking about here, if I may use normally sort of forbidden word, is centralized planning of spectrum resources and how we allocate them and what we do with them. Now, people may think that's a terrible anti-free enterprise notion, but we already do it. We call it the United States budget. The budget is centralized planning. The various agencies put forth their proposals, and the White House makes decisions about what they'll ask Congress for. That kind of centralized planning offers enormous efficiencies. It's one of the principal reasons we won the First World War. Recall that this budgeting process which we currently have started as a policy of the Wilson administration. So that if we want to be an effective international competitor, if we want to be able to take into considerations public safety and national security concerns, and if we want to be in a position to afford the private sector the most capability for innovation, ironically enough, where we have to start is centralized planning of federal federal spectrum policy. This will give us the kind of innate energy, you know, the kind of synchronicities and the kind of economic foundation for making wise decisions which will impact the entirety of our economy over time. I think it's very, very important to realize that what we're proposing here is doing with spectrum policy what we have done since 1916 with respect to the budget.
With that, let's go to our panelists. I think each panelist has 5 minutes for opening remarks, and I've been told to hold you to that, so I will do my best.
Mine first.
I think if you like.
Well, good morning. I'm just going to give a little bit of background about T-Mobile's interest in federal spectrum and our experience, and then talk a little bit about transparency. T-Mobile bid in 2006 in an auction of the AWS spectrum, which was partially comprised, was paired with spectrum that was federal. And there was a law that was passed in 2004 that provided for the relocation of that government spectrum. Set up a fund. It was $14 billion generated by the auction. That fund, I think, put away about half of that money that OMB administers under the law. That money is actually still in OMB's hands. There's about $6 billion sitting in a fund dealing with the AWS relocation. So T-Mobile in the last 2 years has spent a lot of time and effort, and probably been, I think, in the forefront. Tell me, Carl, I think we have been clearing that spectrum. So we have a lot of experience dealing with the government agencies and NTIA and OMB and Congress on the issue. We dealt with 12 government agencies. We had a real good window, I think, after the auction, not so much before the auction, as to their uses. And I think that was sort of an eye-opener for us. So I think we would, we learned a lot from that experience, and we're hoping that some of that can be improved upon. We've been supportive of revamping the relocation process. Jay Inslee has introduced some legislation to that effect, and we're supportive of that. We think that the relocation process is and can and will be a win-win for the government agencies. The idea here is to create money. One of the things that we learned from a lot of these government agencies is that they use, a lot of them do the same thing, but with different equipment. Some of them use analog, some of them use digital. Some of them use 6 megahertz of spectrum, some of them use 20 megahertz of spectrum, the exact same uses. So I think in terms of your discussion about central planning and so forth, I mean, one of the things you got to get hold of first and foremost is what are they using? What are the equipment that they're using? What are they using it for? And have a better understanding around that. And I think that's part of the revamp that we have to the relocation law, is to try to set up an expert panel that can help provide that expertise, because what we heard time and again from OMB, for example, was that they really didn't have the expertise to determine whether FBI needed to spend $250 million to upgrade or $500 million to upgrade. And so providing some of that expertise to the government, I think, is, and for those people who are the central planners, it's called the Office of Management and Budget, would be a positive thing, I think. So transparency is I think, good government. It's accountability. It's a way to, one of the things that we learned is, the government doesn't have the same incentives, quite frankly, as the commercial sector in terms of efficiency. And I've seen this not just in my job, but when I was at the FCC, when I licensed private public safety users in that sector. If you don't pay for anything, you don't pay for spectrum, you really have no incentive to use it more efficiently. And I'd like to understand Harold's zero-based budgeting thing, because I don't quite understand how that works. Because as I understand it, the government doesn't pay for anything. I would love to see them actually have to pay for the spectrum that they use, either in the form of fees or some other incentive. It doesn't necessarily have to be transparency, which I know sometimes freaks the government out a little bit. I mean, they don't want to talk about their uses because, you know, real or imagine, they have some security issues. They have some things that they don't really want to reveal to the public. Well, if that's the case, well, then maybe there's some benign ways that you can get them to think more efficiently in terms of their spectrum usage. One is fees. And I know there's some nominal fees that they pay now to NTIA on the administrative side, but they really don't represent the real market cost of what they're doing here. The other thing we found out is that spectrum is, the folks at NTIA are very well schooled in this, but if you go to the Department of Energy, the Department of Interior, spectrum is not really core to their function. It's something that somebody deep buried inside of those agencies administers, and people at the top of those agencies don't really know what they do. And one of the things that we had to do with our clearing process is educate a lot of the upper management in those agencies about what people were doing deep in their agency with spectrum. So I think that's, and it was only because T-Mobile came rapping at their door and said, this is very valuable stuff, we want to use it, that they sort of said, what is spectrum? You know? I mean, I honestly, I remember sitting around a table with the Department of Justice, and we had language from the public notice that the FCC and NTIA put out saying that T-Mobile and other bidders in the auction could use the spectrum subject to coordination. And of course, for us spectrum geeks, coordination means, you know, coordination in geography, time, etc. When I sat in this room with the Department of Justice, they said, oh, well, we're coordinating now. That's what we're doing. We're having a meeting with you. That's coordination. And they really totally didn't understand what that meant. And so the concept of sharing their spectrum is not something that they're comfortable with, familiar with. I mean, we're still clearing this spectrum in some parts of the U.S. And, you know, one additional anecdote I'll share is that one government agency, you know, basically we wanted to test, we wanted to see if we could share the spectrum with them, and they said, well, it would be too expensive to turn that equipment on to actually do that with T-Mobile. So we only turn that spectrum on, like, you know, once, maybe twice a year. And so that's the type of thing that I think you're dealing with here. It's very complicated, it's complex. It is decentralized, and I think, you know, one of the benefits I'll just sort of wrap up with is that the benefit, I think, in the relocation process is it did provide a pot of money to think about these things, to plan for these things, because the agencies don't, this is costly to them, it's time-consuming for them. Putting some money on the table that they can actually use to plan and move to better technology is something that I think is a positive out of that process and something that we think can continue.
Let's go with Dan.
Thank you all very much. I will be relatively brief. I just want to give you a sense of where the legislative process stands as it relates to spectrum policy, what we envision as potential for movement going forward, what the obstacles are, and essentially where my boss is and what his goals are. So beginning with the legislative process, as you know, we have the inventory bill, which has moved through the House and has moved through the committee in the Senate. Senator Coburn has publicly put a hold on the bill for budgetary reasons. We have continued to work with him, continue to talk to him. We're also reaching out to the agencies, to NTIA and the FCC, to self-initiate significant portions of what is in the bill without the legislation becoming law as soon as possible. That is within their authority, that is within their power. With the House having spoken, the Commerce Committee having spoken, it is something we would like to see happen. There is some question about whether or not the inventory bill itself is adequate. I think a lot of what Harold proposes in his bill, I would say it's modest to call it modest. There are some fairly significant proposals in here, and some of them could, and possibly should be incorporated into a sort of a sum of the inventory bill. There may be a need for a second follow-up to that bill. It deals with some of the issues of relocation, deals with some of the issues of properly defining both goals and metrics. I think here we're talking a lot about efficiency, transparency, innovation, all of the things that are self-evidently people are for. So if they aren't happening, there's 9 times out of 10 a reason, if not quite considered a good reason for that, and we have to deal with what that reason is. I'm fairly optimistic about this area of public policy. If you look at recent statements out of people on both sides of the aisle, essentially spectrum policy and the proper use of spectrum, both at the federal and non-federal level, is at the heart of the National Broadband Plan. If I had to think about, I think both Blair and the chairman, Chowski, are pretty adamant that if there's going to be a third path to the internet, and it's going to be an affordable path, it's going to be over the air. And so to achieve that, you have to establish the premise and have it generally agreed upon. And I think that they've made headway in that direction. Senator Snow published an op-ed a couple months ago in which she said, is there a spectrum crisis? Maybe. Do we need spectrum reform? Definitely. Mr. Ensign has written more than one op-ed on the subject. Is very clearly a supporter of moving forward with change to spectrum policy. As is my boss. We wholeheartedly support the National Broadband Plan. We have worked closely, and Senator Kerry has met on numerous occasions with Chairman Chowski to walk over the details of the plan. We are going to do what we can to help effectuate that. So in that sense, I would argue that on both sides of the aisle, there's a recognition of a need to address spectrum policy, to make more spectrum available to more people. And that's both on the federal side and on the non-federal side. The Center has been active on the white spaces debate. We're looking to establish alliances across the aisle on that as well. So in terms of making federal spectrum its use more transparent, making it more efficient, and encouraging innovation, I think that the key issues are minimizing risk exposure for the agencies. So both in terms of risk exposure and their ability to achieve their mission, and however they use spectrum to help achieve that mission, and risk exposure as a function of finances. So there has to be, as we move forward, some serious consideration of the relationship between the ability to establish fees for spectrum and the distribution of those fees in such a way as to keep people whole. If we're going to affect people's mission at the agencies, and there's a more efficient way to achieve that same mission, but it costs money, we have to give the agencies the capacity to do that. I've worked at agencies. I worked at the Department of Commerce, Department of Labor, and the Clinton administration. I worked at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative in the Obama administration. An immense amount of respect for an immense amount of respect for each agency's mission and responsibilities. And you'll find that objections are not a function of intransigence, that there is a real commitment to mission at each agency, and we have to respect that, and we have to help them meet that mission. So I guess in the short version of all of that is that we are at this point more asking questions than we as legislators have answers. I think that what we're trying to do is establish a baseline understanding of what spectrum speak is exactly. I can tell you that I have a very modern understanding of what spectrum speak is, and I think I care about this stuff a lot. So the process of educating, the process of going through hearings, the process of this kind of interaction with members on the Hill and their staff is critically important. This is, for all intents and purposes, not a year in which we're going to see a lot more big legislative activity, which means that from here to November, there is an opportunity to work with the committees of jurisdiction about establishing a baseline educational standard and a baseline language for communication on these issues. I would note that, as far as I know, there isn't a single economist in the United States Senate, and I think there's a good reason for that. At the end of the day, economic efficiency isn't the end-all and be-all value. It isn't the end-all and be-all good. That there are multiple social ends that we try to meet through public policy and through allocation of public assets that can't be measured in economic returns. So establishing a metric for whether or not spectrum is being used in a way that is proper or just is going to have to encompass much more than how much revenue it generates or what kind of economic activity would generate in the private sector allocated differently. And so establishing what those metrics will be a much longer conversation. But again, I think that the baseline takeaway is that there is a general consensus among leaders in Congress, among leaders at the agencies, that we need to be doing more to make what is a finite public asset better used, more productive, and do it in a way that doesn't retreat from what our social goals are and the purposes of our agencies.
Thank you, Dan. And we're going to next turn to Peter Tenhula. I should mention there should be cards available, and so if inspiration strikes and you'd like to pose a question to our panelists, please feel free to fill out the card, and we'll have them collected and we'll relay them to the panelists. Thank you. So, Peter.
Hello, I'm Peter Tenhula with Shared Spectrum Company. It's a great opportunity to be here. Thanks to Gigi and Harold for inviting me to help participate. I've been dabbling in the spectrum area for about 20 years. Last 4 of which have been with a company called Shared Spectrum Company. As a lawyer, I've been trying to tackle and focus on innovation and efficiency in technology. So I'll try to dumb it down for all you other lawyers. So let me talk a little bit about this technology solution that Shared Spectrum Company's come up with. It promises to help solve, not only the federal government's spectrum woes that we're talking about here today, but commercial sectors as well. And this is without having to relocate, which Larry and Carl talked about earlier, but we'll call it dislocate, the existing systems, which is kind of the big problem now. But it's interesting, I recently came across a government report that, quote, reaches the obvious conclusion that there are no simple answers to many of today's spectrum management questions. Fortunately, the status of spectrum utilization is such that a properly assisted evolutionary process can prevent the otherwise inevitable need for revolutionary changes at a future date. End quote. This report also concluded that for some time to come, technology will continue to play a major role in creating and solving spectrum problems. Eventually, however, the very real limitations of both the amount of spectrum and the intensity with which it can be practically deployed will be approached. End quote. So which report am I quoting from? Is it the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee report from his last meeting, May 19th, which isn't public yet, Jim? The FCC's National Broadband Plan? Integrity. The Aspen Institute report, the Mark author, was one of the best reports I've ever read out of that roundtable, by the way. That was from last November when they met. No. These statements come from a report issued by the National Academy of Engineers in June, wait for it, 1970. So I guess some things never change. I was not surprised to see some of the same issues discussed here exactly 40 years later. While this was not on my kindergarten reading list at age 5, I was glad to come across it thanks to Google Books. But there's lots of other these reports that say the same exact things that Harold report says now, or study says now. You get Coast's paper dating back to 1962 called the Inter Radio Advisory Committee on the IRAP. And there's the other one from 1966 on the silent crisis. And this 1970 report uses the C word quite a bit too. I like the conclusion. Let's rely on technology as opposed to the institutions that regulate that technology. And maybe they'll get out of the way. So what is this technology I'm talking about? Well, the paper mentions it. It's where you've got recommends these new technologies and put up with dynamic assignment to the federal agency on an as-needed basis. That's the technology we're talking about. And the paper mentions that implies that the only federal entity where there exists a culture of innovation and explicit research component is the Department of Defense. So, well, thanks to DoD's innovation and culture and research dollars, Shared Spectrum Company has been able to bring to reality the conceptual notions of dynamic spectrum access through its cognitive radio technology. So our technology enables shared access to the valuable spectrum without requiring the dislocation of the existing users. It enables two or more wireless systems to share the same spectrum bandwidth. We focus on sensing when the channels are idle at any given point or time or location. It addresses spectrum challenges by enabling wireless devices to autonomously, dynamically harvest bandwidth, across the spectrum bands. Enables the devices, which are basically computers, because it's all software. These devices are computers with lots of intelligence. So the software provides dramatic improvement in spectrum utilization, reliability, network deployment time, by really just dynamically adapting to the RF environment through sensing that environment. There's discussion of dynamic spectrum access, or we call it DSA, using also other approaches like a database approach. Carl mentioned that. Databases in Afghanistan aren't that great, so our focus is on sensing. But we'll have a database ability as well, so that when you cross over the border from one country to another, one county to another, one MTA to another, the geolocation aspect of the device senses where you are and determines what the rules are for that particular device. So it can improve the utilization, frequency, location, and time. So it may be a very simple rule that governs the operation of the device. It may only operate in this frequency from 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. We have those kinds of rules or policies, we call them, in addition to the sensing approaches. So another one is a beacon. If you're like a lights and sirens approach, if you get a signal from the incumbent government system, for example, we need to turn on, we're about to start a training exercise, okay, we'll switch to another channel. We don't shut off, we switch to another available frequency, where we're maybe leasing on the secondary market, or maybe licensed to the holder of that device. So we've demonstrated this technology in field demonstrations for the military, and been able to show how it will increase capacity, at least in the DoD bands, up to 10 times. So then we pass 10 times more radios in the same band. So we're also involved in the NTA testbed. Larry mentioned our device has been in Boulder for quite a while now. I think we're about to reach the stage of getting outside and testing it, getting off the bench. So we're really kind of approaching a stage where SSC is ready to commercialize and deploy DSA. It really exists for broadband wireless. So we're pleased that Congress and FCC administration are continuing to encourage adoption of cognitive radio technology and spectrum sharing. We see a lot of opportunities in standing by to show how it works and improve it. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Mark?
Thanks very much, and thanks to Gigi and Harold for having me here. And thanks to Peter for those kind words about the Aspen Institute study that I was fortunate enough to be the rapporteur for. Some of the people who were involved in that study are here. There's Rebecca, there's Carla, Scott, and he's here as well. So if I sort of go off the rails in my comments, comment. The context of the Aspen report was the looming spectrum crisis that Chairman Janikowski had mentioned. And so a major focus was how to find spectrum to fulfill the demand for mobile broadband. And one of the ideas that got special consideration was this idea of a fiber-intensive network architecture where you have more fiber built into the network. You drive fiber closer and closer to the endpoints. You have antennas very, very short distances. You wire it all back to the central office and do the switching there. And the idea is to shrink the cell size so that you can reuse the spectrum, and that way it will take off some of the demand for more spectrum. I want to talk today, though, about some of the ideas that were talked about that are relevant to the discussion about the efficiencies and transparencies in the federal government. And one of those ideas is this idea of an inventory. We saw that the legislation that's beginning to move forward in that area. It calls for an inventory of available spectrum. And a number of the people at the conference that I was the rapporteur on warned about the measure that might be used in the context of an inventory. If you're trying to improve spectrum efficiency, one easy idea is just to say what's used and what's not used. Just go off and measure it and take a snapshot. And if it's not being used, then you know that there's something that can be improved there. Well, it turns out that that can miss a whole lot of important uses. Maybe the use is intermittent, dispersed. It's something that has to be done only in a certain period of time. Maybe the spectrum is being used for a passive sensor, and you won't detect any activity at all if you just take a measurement there. So utilization may not be the right measure if you're trying to figure out whether the spectrum is being used efficiently. And conversely, if you find that the spectrum is being used, that doesn't mean that it's being used effectively or efficiently. It may be that there's a higher or better use for that spectrum, or that the same function could be accomplished by going in the wireline area, and wireless use is just inefficient at that point. So a caution on the idea of an inventory when you're thinking of just conducting usage measurements. You've got to be careful about exactly how that's going to work out. One of the ideas that was brought out was instead of just doing a quantitative assessment of usage, let's get wise people and experts who are actually involved in the use of the spectrum and sit them down and do a qualitative assessment of what the spectrum is used for, what it's likely to be used for, where the growth areas are, and get the assessment. It wouldn't come out with a number, but would come out with a sort of assessment of how that spectrum might be moved forward into the future. There was some discussion of incentives for efficiency in the government. There's a lot of talk about how government isn't efficient because it doesn't have prices and stuff like that. And I think some of the discussion today touched on that issue. One of the speakers in the previous panel really put his finger on one of the primary motives for efficiency in the public sector, which is you're not going to get any more spectrum. So if you're going to accommodate new and additional uses, new and additional users, you've got to find a more efficient way of doing it. And that puts pressure on government officials to be more efficient, even without any kind of market-based operations. One of the warnings that we heard from many of the government participants in the panel was there's not a lot of wasted spectrum out there. So if you think that by looking carefully here, you're going to find a whole bunch of extra spectrum that can be either auctioned or shared. There's not a lot of wastage in the government's use of it. There's some discussion of fees as a way of encouraging efficiency. Some ideas like let's put a requirement for spectrum efficiency in any of the RFPs that are put out for use of the spectrum for wireless purposes, and so on. The third area that I want to comment on is this area of cognitive radio. I think one of Harold's points in the paper that he put out was that maybe one of the goals that we're working towards is further use of cognitive radio. But one of the things that came out of this panel was some disappointment in the development of that technology. I'd be interested in Peter's sense of that as well, that it hasn't moved as far and as fast as people had expected it to several years ago. And one of the proposals, which apparently is under implementation, that came out from the discussion, was to use some of the federal spectrum as a test bed for some of these devices. In effect, allow development research to be conducted at the government's expense by using their spectrum, and that would help improve the quality of the devices, and thereby convince people whose spectrum would have to be shared with those devices that the devices really are ready for prime time, and use the government spectrum for that purpose. Two direct comments on the proposals, the centralized planning proposal that is out there. Note of caution. These ideas of centralizing decision-making within the organization, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. It really does depend on the case. Maybe it's efficient for the federal government to do all its real estate planning, in a centralized fashion. maybe their overall budgeting. But do you really want all personnel decisions to be done in a centralized fashion? Do you want all procurement decisions to be done in a centralized fashion? Maybe yes, maybe no. There's a big case to be made for flexibility at the agency level in a lot of those areas. And it's not clear that we would get much by going to the centralized area in the area of spectrum. And zero-based budgeting, that's pretty draconian. I mean, suppose you did that in the regular budget area. You said, NTIA for your budget for next year is zero, and then make the case that, you should have some money. You do that as a last resort. It's sort of a nuclear option rather than something that you want to do as a beginning of an assessment of the issue. So anyhow, those are my comments, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mark. Okay.
First, thank you very much to Public Knowledge for the invitation. Appreciate being here. One interesting thing from my perspective, I'm happy to see a lot of young people in the room, because in my business it seems like we're all getting older and the new people never show up, and I don't know who's exactly going to take over. So it's good to have you here. One word of warning though. I graduated high school in Laurel, Maryland in 1974. Went to work at some place called OT as a summer intern, then went to college at the University of Maryland. The big change in my life was in the 1970s. President Carter changed the name from OT to NTIA. So basically, I've been at NTIA for 36 years this summer. So spectrum is a little bit dangerous. It may suck you into a black hole. But the one thing from my perspective, 36 years has been good. I mean, it's very interesting, the people you meet, the people you deal with. I think some of the decisions that you make, you actually, if you go home at night, you feel like you've actually accomplished something. So again, if you're really interested in the spectrum, I recommend you stay here because there's a lot of good you can do. And again, a lot of those old guys will be leaving and there'll be places for you. So, Carl, you are retiring soon, right? So I can move up. Okay, just checking. Okay. On transparency specifically, since I wanted to get to that first because I think that's the primary purpose of this discussion. I'll admit, been here 36 years, I learn something new every day. I'll bet you everybody in the audience could teach me something new about spectrum. So if transparency is knowledge, nobody should ever think that they're going to have all the knowledge. Again, I will repeat this. I learn something new every day, and the people I learn from, sometimes it just shocks me. I mean, what goes on out there. So if we can learn from each other, talking these type of discussions, perfect. Because if nothing else comes out of it, we get to hear each other, we get to exchange ideas. So I like that. Concerning NTIA, the CSMAC. The CSMAC, you could argue, is a limited number of public sector people. It's not everybody or whatever, but those discussions, those people raise issues, which lead to other discussions, which leads to questions. NTIA, thinking from a transparency perspective, that's going to be very helpful going down that road. One of the things NTIA found out years ago was the FCC NTIA licensing process. People who were filing for FCC licenses had no idea where they were in the process. It's very easy for the FCC, if anybody's in here, sorry, to say it's stuck over to NTIA. So nobody would ever know where those licenses were. We get calls from congressmen, asking from their staff, asking, where's this license? And we look and we don't even know about it. We don't even have it. So what we did is we put up on our website. If you apply for a license in a shared band or an experiment in a shared band, you can track that on our website. And bottom line, it says up top, if you have a question, you still work for the FCC, they're your regulator. But we did that. We think that was very helpful because, again, that's more transparency. One of the problems with that, and maybe shame on me more than anybody, is a lot of people you're talking, they don't know about that. I don't really know how to get word out about that. People seem to track the FCC every little filing. It's, some lobbyist, 100 lobbyists, the comment on NTIA does something and it's kind of buried in the mud. And sometimes I actually like that. But, so that's one thing we did. One of the things we found out recently is aeronautical bans. Aeronautical bans do not come to NTIA first when the FCC comes over. Since the FAA runs those bans, they actually go through an FAA process, which is a subset of one of our subcommittees. So the FAA sees them first. Things may be able to get lost in this aeronautical group. Things should get lost. I'm head of the IRAC. If they get lost, it doesn't matter if NTIA is even involved in that group. That's my fault. We put up another website under the FCC licensing website for the aeronautical bans. So if it hasn't gotten to us yet in the FAS, which is the normal date, you can find it there. When we find problems, we do our best to fix them. One thing we try to do, which mostly it doesn't go as far as what this group wants to do, is the 70, 80, 90 megahertz. That's a band where whether license is needed or not, very narrow bands, very short distances. NTIA, it's a shared band. If you went into that band, what do? You go to the website, you fill out a form, you can submit that form and you get a green light or a red light saying whether it's okay with NTIA. You never see our database, but you can do your assignments very quickly. Sometimes you may get an orange light, which means more discussion is needed, but basically it's a red light, green light, like that. Now again, we're still asking you to throw a dart in the dark. which maybe isn't fair to you, but it's a lot better than we had before. It's not submitting it to the FCC, you know, the 15, or their process and our process, and you're getting a red light back saying no. So we've tried to do that. We most likely need more of that. But again, we wanted to show something. This is low-hanging fruit, I guess, 70, 80, 90. We wanted to show that worked. We're doing the test bed. The FCC did the white spaces very public. You know, I could go to the websites, the Washington Post, and see people running around with their breadboards and stuff. Very interesting. I mean, that's one way of doing it. What NTIA did is we invited people in to go out to our labs. We wanted to run it through a lab situation. We want to take the equipment. We want to run it through lab tests with a plan for each person. Run it through there. That's first. Then you take it out in the environment. Then you see what it can do. Now, again, the problem with that is it takes a long time. Right, Peter? Sorry. But it's another way of doing things, so we're trying to do that. NTIA, even though I won't give out my phone number, I'll give out Carl's phone number if you need it. We're very open to people. If you want to come see us, let's face it, you're all taxpayers out there. If you call us up, come on in and see us. We're going to be more than happy to talk to you. Sometimes you may not like the answers, but you certainly can come talk to us. In fact, a lot of people that approach the FCC in bands which are dominated by NTIA, the first thing the FCC is mostly going to tell you is you better go talk to NTIA to see if this has a chance of going forward, because they really aren't the experts in the band. So mentioned, the website was mentioned. I'm sure all government agencies are trying to do better on their websites. We're going to try to do better on our website too. But I have to applaud the FCC for their dashboard, and here they put all this effort in. But of course, as soon as you do that, the first thing is everybody coming out of the crack saying, well, you